Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest in our Sunset series of evening talks here at online Morecambe Bay Partnership. Lovely to see so many familiar faces again. And we have had a really good sort of regular attendance at these. It's become a real focal point, I think, for the fortnight. And I've started missing them now when they're not on. I missed it a bit last Tuesday. I found myself a bit bereft. So thanks for joining. We have Simon Williams with us, who's the chair of the Mourholme Local History Society. And Simon's going to say a little bit more about where Mourholme is, because it is quite an interesting story, and a bit more about the Local History Society. But Simon came across the story of the Matchless disaster back in 2008, and it turned into a bit of a fascination for him. And we're going to find out a little bit more about that and how he uncovered this amazing story. I think out of all the evening talks we've had, in some ways this is the one I'm most looking forward to, because I know absolutely nothing about this story at all, even though I live in Silverdale. And the first time I came across it was because I was asked to advertise this on a previous evening. It's lovely when you know nothing at all about the story. So I'm intrigued and really looking forward to finding out more, as I'm sure we all are. And we've been running these now all the way through the autumn and winter, really as a way of keeping in touch with our friends and supporters around Morecambe Bay Partnership. And as I've said very regularly on these talks, Morecambe Bay Partnership is not just the staff and it's not just the volunteers. It really is all those of you who love the bay and are involved in any aspect of helping to look after it or celebrate it. We really are a community-based charity, and one that survives and thrives because of all of you, our supporters. So it's been great that this has hit a nerve, and we've had such high attendance at all of them. So it's just been a way of keeping in touch, a way of, I guess, continuing to celebrate and uncover the stories of the bay, whether that's the history or the built heritage, the natural heritage, other aspects of the culture, oral histories, access. We really have covered all the things that make Morecambe Bay special, and all the areas of work that Morecambe Bay Partnership focus on in this series. So, Simon, I shall hand over to you. Thanks very much for joining us.
Right, thank you. I'm just going to say a few words of introduction, who I am, and a few words about the Mourholme. And then I'll switch into a PowerPoint presentation and take you through the story. First of all, I'm not a professional historian. I had a career in communications and marketing, and I retired in, I think it was 2007, and came up to Silverdale in 2008. And it was while I was researching this old house that we bought, what's the story behind our house, that I came across a much smaller tragedy. It was actually a boating tragedy in 1850, where the inhabitant of the house here took some of their posh Manchester friends for a boating trip across to Kent's Bank, across from Silverdale to Grange and then to Kent's Bank. And it ended in disaster with 5 men losing their lives, just not quite making it back to the boat and getting stuck in the creeks and the sands. And there was a bit of a scandal about whether the locals had given enough assistance to these men. So it made for quite a bit of a drama. And one thing led to another. I started looking more widely at shipwrecks on the Morecambe Bay. And I came across just a passing reference to this, the Matchless disaster. And I then embarked upon what became more than a fascination. I mean, it probably was an obsession for best parts of a year. I was doing other things at the time, but travelling the libraries of the north of England, because the local reporters from each town wrote up their version of what had happened and had different evidence. So I visited the libraries to go through the microfiches of their old newspapers. Morecambe, Kendal, Barrow, Burnley, Bolton, Skipton, Lancaster, Preston and Bradford. That's a lot of library visiting. And Access County Records, National Archives. And then something quite fascinating happened. And this was my Howard Carter breaking into the tomb of Tutankhamun moment, when at Burnley Library, as I'd finished my research and was about to leave, I asked the woman at the desk, I'm researching this story about the Matchless. Is there anything else you've got? And she tapped her keyboard and said, would you just wait here a moment? And came back a few minutes later with a slim card folder. And in it was the memories of one of the survivors of this disaster. So he was more than an eyewitness. She was actually a participant in the disaster and told a very detailed story. Her name was Fanny Brierley, and she was a child at the time of the disaster, but grew up and in her 40s or 50s wrote this story. And her descendant, who now lives in America, actually placed it in the Burnley Library. So there you go. If you've got anything fascinating, put it in a proper archive, because researchers somewhere will treasure it. So that brought the whole thing to life for me. So let me say a couple of words about the Mourholme. It's the local history society for Lancashire's most northern parish. And that's the old parish, the ancient parish of Wharton, which actually scoops in Carnforth. Not that that was much way back. The Yellans, Silverdale, Priest Hutton, Borwick. What am I forgetting? I think that's about it. So it's, yes, an ordinary little North Lancashire parish. But there's any parish has got fascinating tales if you dig deep. If you want to know more about us and see what we're up to, we have a website. Mourholme, where is Mourholme? If you look it up on an atlas, you won't find Mourholme. It was the name of the castle that was right in the middle of all of this. It was a castle that is now covered by Pine Lake on the A6. And Pine Lake was quarried out for gravel, helped build the M6. The castle had long been gone. But the name seemed a good one. Otherwise, you have to say Walton, Yelland, Carnforth, and the rest of it. So that's Mourholme. One last thing I'd say is there's no photographs or portraits of the participants. Photography hadn't caught up with it really, so I've had to put together a PowerPoint with diagrams and things that will get us through the story anyway. So yes, it's a disaster. It's 25 tragedies and a public scandal. It's also a forgotten disaster because I was unable to find anyone else who had written this up. It had to be primary research. Quite extraordinary. The time is September 1894, and the place is Jenny Brown's Point. There's the map of the bay that you know well, and that little arrow shows where Jenny Brown's Point is. I'm sure everyone will have been there, I expect. So it's 120 years ago this month. Morecambe Bay's greatest ever loss of human life. That's actually more than the Chinese cockle pickers. Not that that's a proud boast, but it is. It happened here, and it was forgotten. And I think the authorities wanted this forgotten, as I will explain. Terrific beauty spots, a gorgeous place to watch sunsets, a fantastic place to do your bird watching, and a lovely place to do walks. And it's full of history. Top left, that's Brown's houses, date unknown, but they have a commanding view of the bay. And Brown's house is probably named after Jenny Brown's family. Jenny Brown, who was Jenny Brown? We don't know for sure, but I and others have researched her, and there was a Janet Walling that was born in the early 17th century at Dyke House Farm, which is right behind Brown's houses. She married a neighbour who was Brown, so she became Jenny Brown. She had a daughter who she named Jenny Brown. So we've got two Jenny Browns. It's something to do with them. What they did to have a place named after them, I don't know. There are lots of theories. Some of them are scurrilous. To the right, as you know, the sands shift in Morecambe Bay, and in the 1990s, this washed out of the sands to everyone's surprise, this little stone jetty. And again, what it is, no one's sure. It's probably associated with the chimney behind, but no one knows. And it was concrete capped and pointed just to preserve what's there. Bottom left, there's this 1.25 mile extension into the sea, a large embankment, partly washed over, sometimes buried in the sands for decades, and then it appears again, and people have to work out what on earth it was all over again. I've researched that one. It was built by Herbert Walduck in the 1870s. Herbert Walduck was the man who built Carnforth Ironworks, and it was a land reclamation scheme. It had a shared subscription. It was going to enclose about 60,000 acres. It was a much harder job to build that wall than was reckoned. Stones were sinking faster than they could lay them. And in the end, the thing ran out of money. But that I call Walduck's Wall a folly. And bottom right, there's the famous chimney. Again, no absolutely authenticated history of the chimney. And I was pleased to work with Morecambe Bay Partnership on an archaeology project to try and bottom out that whole story. And I think we did a pretty good job. And that we do know that it was part of a copper smelting process in the 1790s. Anyway, those are whole other topics, but it just goes to show we're talking about a beauty spot full of historic interest. Well, let's start with the story of Morecambe. 1894, Morecambe's prospering, has a population of 6,500, but it has 30,000 holiday makers and 30,000 day trippers on top of that. So what started as a little fishing village had turned into a considerable resort. The train had come in 1848, and Morecambe got the descriptor Bradford by the Sea because Bradford became connected via the Midland Railway. And it'd only been Morecambe for 5 years by then, when Torres Home, Bear and Portland Sands were all combined. In modern marketing parlance, it had a brand positioning. I think it had anyway. It's a bit more upmarket and less garish and noisy than Blackpool. Offering fantastic views of the Lakeland Fells and gentle trips into the surrounding countryside. So the people who probably chose that probably wanted something a bit quieter than Blackpool for their holiday. But it did have some posh stuff there, posh amusements. People's Palace with an aquarium and baths. It had a promenade pier. It had Punch and Judy, donkey rides, summer gardens, and it had boating trips, which is where this story comes in. Morecambe was really competing for the shillings and pounds of the mill workers of Northern England, competing against Southport, Scarborough, Bridlington, Filey and Blackpool. And competing for the Wakes Weeks money. You probably know about Wakes Weeks. This is when a mill town was shut down for repairs or improvements for a whole week. And that's when the inhabitants would take their holidays. And they'd take their holidays from one of those, grim. Each town had a different Wakes Week, so it spread the load on the various resorts. Burnley's was late summer, so it was that in this story, around half of the Matchless passengers were from Burnley that September day. Burnley was the major casualty. So yeah, people were wanting to escape this grim air of the industrial north and come to something like that: clean air, amusements, perambulations on the prom. couple of postcards here to just get you in the mood for Wakes Weeks, really. Have a greatly good holiday. It really was a massive break from normal life. This is what that looks like for 1 week in the year. Yeah. So, Wakes Weeks. Typically, actually, when I'm researching this, I came to find that it wasn't the whole family that necessarily went on holiday, and mill working families, which were often quite large families, probably couldn't afford that everyone went. So one or two parents, probably one parent, would take a selection of the children, and they might go for less than a week. It might just be for a couple of nights, or it just might be day trips, just what their budget would afford. So yes, a mother would take 2 or 3 kids for 3 or 4 days. And let's go straight into one of the important families of this story, the Brierleys. And here's their house, 1 Queen Street, Briarcliff, on the outskirts of Burnley. It's actually right down the road from the Queen Street Mill, which is only recently closed as a working mill museum. So there it still is. This little house has 3 bedrooms, and in it lived William and Betty and their 7 children. In fact, the eldest 2 were already mill workers, so 4 adults and 5 children, basically. The dad, William, he was starting to prosper, and he and his father had actually gone into business, taking out a share of the mill on their own account. Betty had just become pregnant again, and so she stayed at home when William took 2 of the kids to Morecambe for a few days. She took Fanny, that little girl who went on to write her account. She was 9, and Ben was 7. Fanny just remembered so much, and I just remember reading this folder in the library before I had it photocopied, and was just mesmerised. The detail. They set out from Burnley Station, and a boy was leaning out of the train window and coming back into their compartment. He was sick down Fanny's only frock. And the boy's mother said, "Oh, well, it'll wash. I have a frock like that and it washes like new," which doesn't really work if you've got a sick covered frock for a train journey. She remembers their trip to the Silverdale Fairy Steps on the edge of Beetham, where they collected nuts. And she remembered their trip to the Morecambe Summer Gardens. And she remembered the detail of their morning stroll on the prom, where her dad posted the card home saying they'd be home the next day. And on the same stroll, he bought them oysters from an oyster seller, which were horrible. So Fanny wrote. And worse, her dad then said they'd go on a sail to Grange. And Fanny said no, she didn't want to go. She really was quite frightened. But here's the Princess Landing Pier at Morecambe as it was. And of course, the large pier there, sadly gone now. But this was the landing pier. 3 of them stepped on this narrow landing stage to walk down and choose the boat that they were going to get into, and they chose the Matchless. This was a typical Morecambe Bay fishing boat, what's called a Lancashire nobby. There's a Lancashire nobby. It is a fishing boat. It has a shallow draft so that it doesn't beach on the shallow waters of the bay. The Matchless was 33 foot, half-decked, one of the largest. Mainsail, topsail, foresail and jib. And it was rigged so that it could be sailed by a single man from the tiller, and he would do all the work, and some of them might take a boy out, but generally it'd be a one-man operation. And it was converted to be a pleasure boat for the season until under a Morecambe licence. In fact, 300 of the Morecambe fishermen licensed their boats to be passenger day trippers. As in all disasters, and it happens still, in a rail disaster or a plane disaster, there's a retrospect about what had happened, and it suggests the hand of fate decided who should just miss that plane or be forced upon the other train that crashed. And so it was with the Matchless. And the crowds on the Morecambe prom chose their boat for a sail. William Briley actually told Fanny they'd all go home if she refused to sail. So he actually really put his foot down. So they boarded. There was Joseph Carter, the sports writer for the Bradford Observer, and his young wife and 2-year-old Doris. They boarded, despite having solemnly promised his mother, Joseph's mother, that they wouldn't go on a sail. I don't know why she had warned them not to, but she had. Anyway, they went on a sail. There were 3 middle-aged sisters who had gone with their husbands, and the sisters decided they wouldn't go on the boat, and they waved off their respective husbands, who all got onto the Matchless. All 3 of those men were to drown, and the 3 sisters would be widowed by the end of the day. A particularly grim story. There was a 13-year-old girl who refused to board, and she was allowed to wait ashore. She was old enough. She waved off her parents and sister, and only her father survived. Lots of cruel tragedies. The skipper of the Matchless was Samuel Houghton. He's a 54-year-old lifetime sailor at this point. And the Matchless seemed to be, for whatever reason, the popular boat that day. And Houghton had to turn some people away who wanted to board. But by then, he had taken on board 33. 33 on a boat that one man sails. It was so full that a number of the passengers had to stand. The Matchless set out at 10:15. High tide was 1:30 p.m. It's a 9.4 metre tide, so quite a big one. And this is the route. I'll come on to the route in a second. Let me just talk just a bit about this photograph. This was actually after I wrote my little book on this and had completed my studies. A member of our society got in touch and said, Simon, I found a photograph of the Matchless. And he had, by a circuitous route, there'd been a bit of a sharing of historic photos in Grange. By that circuitous route, this photo had come to light. It's taken from Grange, looking across to Silverdale. I went back into the archives and absolutely demonstrated that 23 LR is the Matchless. And I rather think that person towards the bow of the boat is Samuel Houghton, but I'm not sure why. But you can see some passengers have been rowed out to join it. There were newspaper reports. Some of them carried sketches of the disaster. And here's the Princess landing stage at the top. And this is from the Lancaster Daily Post. And the tranquil scene of the disaster below, Jenny Brown's Point. And this is the route. This is what you got for your money. A sail from Morecambe, which would hug the coast. Before the tide came in, there's always some sort of a channel going on. And once it got to Silverdale and once enough water had come into the bay, they'd make the crossing to Grange, let the people off for a short while, and then bring them home. And that little asterisk marks the spot of the disaster. So they set off a little convoy of Grange-bound boats, meandering along, almost wasting time, waiting for the tide to come in. Just a light breeze, nothing to worry about, thoroughly pleasant. And as they approached Jenny Brown's Point, the Matchless passengers decided to get up a sing, as they put it. And they were singing little hymns and little children's songs that had boats in them. So they were singing, "We are out on the ocean sailing," and a little ship was at sea. Fanny didn't sing. She was sat in the bottom of the boat, still in a sulk. Another passenger offered her a pair, and I don't think that cheered her up either. "Are you sick?" were her father's last words to her, because the Matchless had been sailing an hour and 23 minutes when it had just reached the end of Walduck's Wall. We know this precise time because there were 2 stopped watches that were recovered from the accident, one from a live man, one from a dead man. The time was 11:38, and the place was just past the end of this reclamation wall. A sudden gust of wind blew a passenger's hat off, and the wind caught the boat broadside. The jib came across and the boat was blown flat onto the water with absolutely no pause. There was no moment for anyone to do anything. It was straight over. This was in a newspaper, a contemporary sketch by an eyewitness, it was labelled. And from all the descriptions that were later given in the inquest, it seems to fit exactly what happened. Many made a grab for that upper gunwale, but they just couldn't stop the boat from turning over and sinking within seconds. Everyone was in the water now, fighting for their lives, wearing those heavy boots and heavy clothes of Victorian mill workers. There's probably only 8 or 9 foot of water underneath them, but down they went, and then some of them bobbed up again, and people were watching from the other boats in horror at this sight. This was an age where virtually no one swam. Even fishermen didn't swim. Samuel Houghton wasn't a swimmer. Fanny went under and thought, I'm done for. And she popped up again, and then she sunk. And underwater, she grabbed hold of 2 other bodies. Well, why this occurred at all? This skipper was very experienced with the winds of the bay. Well, clearly this boat was overloaded, and with just 1 crew member, the ropes had to be fastened to cleats and couldn't be released quickly. The smart thing to have done would be to let the sails go, and that was impossible to do that quickly. Everyone would have perished had there not been those other 2 boats nearby. They're both skippered by men called Gardner, which is a common Morecambe name, and they were no relation. The nearest boat was the Band of Hope. It was 100 yards behind the Matchless, and it was running with the current and quickly upon them. Edward Gardner shouted to his panicking 18 passengers, and they were panicking, all the ladies must sit down and the men must get ready for work. I'll go right into the lot. And that's what he did. He sailed in amongst them, and they hooked people with walking sticks or grabbed hold of them. Edward Gardner told them not to haul them into the boat and risk capsizing his own boat, but just hold them to the side until they could actually supervise getting them in properly. There was a young woman called Lizzie Walker. She surfaced dramatically with a child in each hand, and it happened to be Fanny and her brother Ben. Lizzie, the young woman, and Ben were unconscious. They were hauled into the boat, and some form of artificial respiration was applied to them. Fanny pronounced that Ben was her brother. And while all of this had gone on, other boats had arrived, 2 more boats, and they started picking up more survivors and more dead bodies. One rescued by the second boat was a young man, James Boothman, and he happened to be the fiancé of Lizzie, that young woman. So they were rescued by separate boats, Lizzie unconscious, James very conscious. He was actually the only swimmer. He was a member of the Burnley Swimming Club. And he sat in that boat and he looked into the water all the way back to Morecambe, saying not a word. Sure, he had lost his loved one. I say back to Morecambe, but actually the panicky passengers, they just wanted to get to the nearest dry land, and they could see Grange quite close by. And they even tried to bribe the boatmen to take them to Grange rather than back to Morecambe. And I think the boatmen realised, no, they needed to go and get the authorities alerted. So the Band of Hope was the first boat back to Morecambe. The police were alerted. The children were sat on the bench and given brandy. And as Ben opened his eyes, Fanny told him, "We've been shipwrecked," with a note of excitement in her voice. What to do with all of these wet and bedraggled people and bodies? The oyster seller comes back into this story. The oyster seller carried Fanny to the Bath Hotel, where she and Ben were put in a room together with that young woman, Lizzie. Everyone assumed Lizzie was their mother. And so they were put in that room. But soon the police came in and started asking questions. Very quickly, the scene at the landing stage became quite chaotic. There's a large crowd. The word just got around Morecambe in no time at all. And there was a large crowd of the genuinely worried because they'd waved off loved ones onto the various boats that had gone out. And there was confusion as to what had happened. And there were just people who wanted to look at a scene of an accident, just rubberneckers. And then there was the poor police trying to make sense of this. How many were on the boat? How many were rescued, alive or dead? And all importantly, names. And then there were survivors who'd got back, rushing around to see if other boats had brought in their nearest and dearest. So quite chaotic. A little cameo appearance here from the glamorous Ada Webb. There's a popular attraction at the People's Palace. I mentioned that there was an aquarium there. What happened in that aquarium was that Ada would give daily performances of what we've probably now called synchronized swimming, and with her lovelies. Anyway, she was fetched because it was understood that she knew something about resuscitation. So she was taken around various people to try and resuscitate them. But frankly, by that time, I would have think people were either definitely alive or definitely dead. But anyway, she gets a good mention. The aftermath now is just like much any today. Police trying to get that coherent picture. Who was aboard, who was alive, who was dead, who was missing. 9 had survived, but that they hadn't necessarily hung around in their wet clothes to get their names and details taken down. They'd probably dashed off to get changed. And 25 drowned. 9 survived, and very sadly, 25 drowned. But this took a further day for the police to bottom out. The skipper was alive, and that was some help, although he was heard to mutter quite understandably, "I wish I drowned." And there's a sense of responsibility. He rushed off to go with the others back to the scene to see if more could be rescued, or at least bodies found. And one of the local steamers was commandeered and sent to the scene. Then the second and third rescue boats got back with more live and more dead. The police set up a mortuary in the Morecambe Football Club's changing rooms, and they were then at the rear of the King's Arms Hotel. And they put the bodies along the changing room benches. James Boothman, that fiancé, he came back, and he wasn't to find out for hours that his fiancée had been rescued and carried off to the Bath Hotel to recover. So that must have been a very long few hours of his life. A newspaper printed a sketch of that now demolished football club changing rooms with its snaking queue. You can just about make up Morecambe Football Club over the door, and now labelled a mortuary. Queues started to form to inspect and identify the bodies so far recovered. Of the 25 that were drowned, 16 were found in the first 24 hours. And one of the most useful sources of identification were the landladies of Morecambe, who noticed that their guests hadn't returned but had heard of the tragedy. So they trooped along to the mortuary to identify their guests. And there were other much larger queues at the post office. The crowds of holiday makers wanting to send telegrams home just to say to their families that they were safe, that they hadn't been on the Matchless. And they needed to be quick, and they needed to send telegrams because the newspapers were very fast off the mark. And when I was touring all of these northern libraries and reading the local reports, they were out within hours. The first stories were in local newspapers and listing who was dead and who wasn't, and just getting some of the facts understandably wrong. I mean, one thing that was printed in the Burnley newspaper was that Lizzie had lost her life. And you could just imagine the consternation in families who had loved ones in Morecambe that day. But Lizzie somehow managed to get a telegram sent home, and it said simply, "Can't get home tonight, been upset in boat, safe, Lizzie." Search parties carried on working through the night, pulling out bodies and piling them up. Now we come on to the inquest. The inquest was held in the dining room of the King's Arms, and that's how it looks now. It's a large snooker room upstairs in the King's Arms. That was turned into the inquest. It started the very morning after the disaster. It suspended at lunchtime, and it took one more morning, and the whole thing was wrapped up. Really quite indecently quick, in my view. The county coroner was a very experienced man, Lawrence Holden, 68. He actually didn't retire until he was 79, did another 11 years, by which time he'd got 50 years service under his belt. It really is an inquest. It's not really an inquiry. It's there to establish the cause of the death and briefly, if anyone was to blame. But there was a jury of 14, which is good. However, it was led, the foreman of the jury was none other than the leader of the council, John Lee. And if anyone's to blame for all of this, it's probably the council. So a bit of a conflict of interest, I'd suggest. Yeah, I've put up these pictures. I mean, these don't look like fisher folk of Morecambe Bay, but anyway, it gets us through the story. They found relatives and sent telegrams home to get relatives to come and identify bodies, which they did in all but one of the 13 found so far. And then the skipper was called, Samuel Houghton was called to give evidence, followed by the skippers of the 2 rescue boats. And then the evidence of a few of the survivors was taken. So it was quite a quick thing, really. But what wasn't examined? Well, the mattress itself wasn't recovered and examined, at least not by the time of this inquest. There was no marine expert witness to discuss the seaworthiness of a boat loaded with 34 people. But what came out during all of this was that passenger boats were licensed by local bylaw, by Morecambe themselves. Light touch regulation doesn't begin to describe this particular licensing regime. If you wanted your boat licensed, it wasn't examined for seaworthiness. The skipper was just judged merely by local reputation. No crew were required, and you were required to have no lifelines or life buoys. You might think, well, isn't that just the Times? Well, it wasn't elsewhere. Other resorts had much better bylaw regulations. So just 2 mornings' work, and the coroner summed up and directed the jury to go away and return a verdict of accidentally drowned. The jury retired, and after 10 minutes retirement, the foreman, Morecambe's leader, and the man ultimately responsible for the bylaws, announced a unanimous verdict of accidentally drowned. And he added that no blame was attached to anyone. The jury wished in particular to exonerate Samuel Houghton, the skipper. This was actually the first of 6 such inquests, because every time new bodies are found, there has to be another inquest. But this was the one where all the evidence was taken in detail. The other inquests were really just identification of bodies. The coroner concluded, and he was quite a verbose man. I've read the full transcript of what he said, and it goes on. So I'm going to summarise his summary. Nobody was to blame, not the boatman or the council. The police and the fishermen were congratulated for their fine work. Medals are recommended for the 2 Gardner skippers. And he thought it commendable that Morecambe was going to pay for the bodies to be repatriated to their home addresses. I would have thought it's the least Morecambe could do. This is pretty much a whitewash. Anyway, what of Fanny and Ben left in the Bath Hotel? Their landlady from their lodgings had visited them, and when asked, where's our father? She said, oh, don't you worry, he'll have been picked up by another boat. Their uncle John was fetched by telegram, and he came to identify the father's body and then to take them home on the train, again avoiding telling the children what had happened to their father. Burnley Station, that's Burnley Banktop Station. All survivors and dead in Burnley in particular were now celebrities. And the station was absolutely besieged by thousands of onlookers. So the police had to close the platforms and institute crowd control measures. Uncle John left the children in the waiting room. As unbeknown to them, he supervised the loading of their father in his coffin out of the guards van and into the rear of this strange contraption. It's a sort of hearse. It's called a shillabeer, and the coffin sits in the front end, and passengers are carried in the rear end. So that coffin was loaded into the front of the shillabeer, and John and the children climbed into the back, and still the children had no idea what was going on. This took them through the streets of Burnley, which was thronged by thousands of people all the way home, with thousands of people. And it was here at last, when they got home, that their mother told them the truth, that they'd lost their father. The next day, the funeral was held at the Hagate Baptist Channel, again in front of an unseemly mass of gawpers. It's an old picture of Hagate Chapel because it's long demolished. And his gravestone is here, and his inscription reads, in loving memory of William Brierley, who lost his life in the boating disaster of Morecambe, September 3rd, 1894, aged 41. A few months later, his widow gave birth to that son and named him William. So what happened next? Well, the other bodies still had to be found. Every asterisk is a body, and you can see they were found all over the bay, in the Walney Channel at Barrow, Ulverston, Arnside. 2 were found under the Arnside Railway Viaduct. Just one arm and one leg sticking out of the sand. That's how they were discovered. All very grim stuff. And finally, in January, so 4 months later after the accident, the Bradford reporter's wife's body was discovered tangled in the supports of the new pier at Grange. What else? Well, Morecambe got up a fund of £236 in subscriptions, but this was just used to transport the bodies home. Burnley had all sorts of fundraising events in mills and chapels and concert halls, and raised £739 for the most needy of the bereaved, such as Mrs. Parkinson, who'd lost her husband but had 5 children to care for. Some happier news in this sad story. James Boothman and Lizzie Walker went on to get married, having so nearly lost their lives. And within 6 months, Morecambe Council had passed a new bylaw with a new licensing regime, stipulating crewing arrangements, boat inspections, and life-saving equipment. It's a popular jibe today to say health and safety gone mad. Well, in those days, it's health and safety gone missing. And it carried on. A year and 6 days after the Matchless disaster, Morecambe had another public relations disaster as its pier collapsed, pitching dozens into the water, killing 3 of them. So it was a hard time. This is just a table of all of the people who were on the boat that day, and it's just my little memorial to them. It is sad, but there's 25 individual tragedies there. a few very lucky escapes as well. Esther Clegg, who's halfway down on the right-hand column, 47. She'd actually gone to Morecambe. She was suffering from breast cancer, and she'd gone for some air. She survived this, and so she went on to say her breast cancer disappeared and never came back. But I thought it'd be a fitting end to this talk just to end with the words of the descendant of Aunt Fanny. And she emailed me in a couple of years ago. And I'll let you read what she wrote about the Matchless. So there you are. That's the sad story of the Matchless. And I'm pleased to say it's no longer the forgotten tragedy of Morecambe Bay. We can remember it now. And I will end there and go back to you, Tom.
Thank you. Sorry, I just feel I was quite moved there at the end. Sorry. Seeing the list of names and then the quote, it really brings it very, very close, I think. But thank you, Simon. That was really, really vivid. It really, I mean, the way you tell it and with all the images, it's very filmic actually as well, isn't it? You know, it's a local version of a story that in some ways we've heard in other places, whether it's Titanic or other sort of disasters. But yeah, sorry, I'll recover in a second.
It is filmic. It would make a film. It's, I think, particularly with the inquest scene, if you like, and you know, actually reading the full testimony of Samuel Houghton when he was standing in the dock, terrible ordeal for a man to go through. He did actually take up fishing again. I doubt that he ever took up pleasure boating again. Yeah.
No, yeah, I mean, I've seen pictures of those Lancashire nobbies, you know, off Silverdale, and my understanding is a lot of them were made at the little shipyard in Arnside, weren't they?
Yes, that's right. Crossleys, yes.
Yeah.
I think his one was made at Overton, so just down the Lancashire coast.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Well, I'll come to some questions now. There's lots of people finding it very moving. And some, you know, lots of really nice comments about you, Simon, and the way you've told the story. So thank you. So I'll start with one of kind of obvious question. It has been answered on the chat, but for those of you who aren't reading it, so people are asking about whether they can buy the book that you wrote. And Claire has posted on there that although the booklet is out of print, it is freely downloadable. So if you have a look at the chat, you'll see the link that Claire's posted. So it's a PDF, which is a bit of a pain, but obviously you could print that PDF out so that you could have it as a written copy.
It's on the Mourholme website under the publications tab. So.
Great. Okay. So if you go to the Mourholme Local History Society, you can get it from there as well. Another one here. I'm going to start at the bottom and then work up. Is there a memorial to the people who died either in Morecambe or in Burnley?
No, there isn't, and I'm absolutely certain that the last thing that Morecambe wanted was a memorial to this. You know, they wanted this hushed up and forgotten as soon as possible. Almost get it out of the newspaper as soon as possible.
Yeah. Thank you. So there's a thank you here for all the research. Some thanks for bringing the story to light and sharing it. There's a comment here. This is really interesting. This brings it to life as well. Queen Street Mill that you mentioned, where the Brierleys were from, is where the factory scenes from the film The King's Speech was filmed. So if you watch that film, you'll get a flavour. So there's another comment here, which I think you've answered. So were there any known safety improvements arising from the accident? So you mentioned that 6 months later, the licensing was changed and tightened up.
Yes, I think probably one of the main things was, depending on the weather conditions, and those were stipulated, you had to have a lad to at least take the money. So rather than what Samuel Houghton had to do, which was tie off all the ropes and wander around a overcrowded boat collecting money halfway across. Sounds like the most dangerous possible thing to do. So at least there was going to be a lad on board, and there had to be lifelines and life buoys.
And because obviously, so September would have been nearing the end of the season, or would have been the end of the season, and then 6 months later is the start of the following season. So there was a connection, was there, with this incident?
That seems to make sense, I guess. So, yeah.
Okay. Alison says, "Thank you. Very sad. What a huge impact it will have had on all those families affected. Those Wakes holidays were such a huge part of the lives of East Lancashire mill workers, part of our cultural history." I mean, I don't think they exist now, the Wakes weeks, but I mean, my wife grew up in Oldham, and when she was at school, they still had the Wakes weeks then, and they had different school holidays in the different towns. That's still in the 1980s. So, right. So I think that's all the questions on the feed. One I had was, how long did the pleasure boat industry at Morecambe survive? Do you know when it finally finished?
I really don't know, and I think it's such a shame that there are no boat trips on the bay, despite having researched a tragedy. I mean, I think anyone who's done the Cross Bay walks just knows just the difference in perspective that you get from halfway across. And I think it's a real shame that you can't take pleasure boats out onto the bay.
Yeah.
Whether it was health and safety regulation that just put it out of business, I don't know.
I mean, would they have still been running as recently as, say, the 1950s, which was obviously a big boom time for Morecambe and Heysham?
I'm probably someone else would know that better than me, as I'm not a local man.
Okay.
There's someone who's just said that, it was there when she was born in 1931, and there were 3 boats. Oh, there we are.
Yeah. So certainly lasted a good long time. Great. Well, that's a great trip from Morecambe to Grange.
Did you want to tell us, Gail, your memories of the boats?
Yeah, sorry, that should say 51. It was a mistype. Yeah. And there were 3 boats that used to go out. My dad also had been at sea, so occasionally they let him do the steering and things. He'd been in the Navy, but there were 3 boats that you could go off on little half-day short trips. You could go on the bay in those. I can remember kind of walking from Bear to the centre of Morecambe and going with my dad from one of the jetties.
Yeah, thank you, Gail.
I'm sorry, that should be 51, not 31. And I also remember, because it's the thing having grown up from several generations born in Morecambe, the thing that we always learned, I was at school in Poulton, and one of the things that my parents were really keen on was that I learned to swim because of past disasters that there'd been. So I think that lived in the consciousness of people that had been there and grown up in the area. And it was seen as the importance of learning to swim.
Yeah. That's fascinating.
Michelle, you've got your hand up. Is that?
Yeah, I just was going to say, when we did the Fishing Oral History project, collecting memories of the Morecambe Bay fishing communities, there's quite a lot of memories and information shared about fishermen supplementing fishing families, supplementing their income with the tourism industry and things. So I don't know the exact date when pleasure boats stopped, but I'm sure it's probably in the archive on the Recording Morecambe Bay website. And there's also, I just typed in pleasure boat into our archive, and it threw up a couple of nice photographs, which I don't think I can share my screen, so I can't share them. But if anybody goes onto the Recording Morecambe Bay website, you can type in pleasure boat, and there's a few, some from Keith Willis's collection that he shared with us, and various others that have come up with pictures of some of the launches going from the pier in Morecambe. So if anybody wants to have a look.
Do you want to say a little bit more about the archive then, for people who aren't familiar with it?
Oh, I think Claire's just letting me share my screen. Let me just see if I can quickly do that. Can you see that? That's just an example.
Yeah.
Of one of the launches going 1920s, I think that one says. So that's a slightly earlier one. But, so this is the Recording Morecambe Bay website, which we set up to sort of showcase a lot of the archaeology and heritage work that Morecambe Bay Partnership was doing over sort of last 5 or 6 years. So it's full of archaeology reports, shared photographs, there's loads of oral histories. If you go under the Voices tab there at the top, we did a big project recording hundreds of hours of stories from retired fishermen, existing fishermen, fishing families, everybody involved in the industry really. And there's clips on there, there's also resources, newspapers full of extracts, all sorts of things if you're interested in the fishing heritage. But the kind of tourism goes hand in hand with the fishing story really. So a lot of the interviewees will talk about that. So it's really worth having a poke about in the archive and seeing what you find of interest.
Brilliant, thank you. It's a really, really good link, isn't it, to have for people inspired by Story Tonight who want to find out a little bit more. Thank you, Michelle. Okay, on the same subject of archives, so Andrew has posted the Northwest Film Archive have a film from 1948 showing some pleasure boats that's available on Vimeo. Miss Bleakley writes that there were 300 fishing boats working out of Morecambe in 1848 at the time that the railway arrived. That is, it's a staggering number, especially if they were all then converting into pleasure boats for the summer season. It's remarkable numbers. Thanks, Susanna.
Perhaps it cost nothing to license, and I mean, I really can't imagine more than a dozen or so picking up passengers at a time. But
no, but I mean, if you're only getting, a couple of dozen passengers on a single boat, then obviously, given the numbers who were going there and the things that they would be wanting to do, you would need that number of boats, wouldn't you, to be comparable with, say, one of the Windermere steamers, for instance.
They did have 2 steamers there as well. So
yeah. So where did the steamers go then? Because if they were engine powered, they would have struggled, wouldn't they, in the very shallow waters?
I guess you're right. I guess they went just for a sail across the wider part of the bay.
Yeah.
Maybe down to Fleetwood.
Yeah. No, fascinating. Okay, so Simon, thank you very, very much. I think everyone, you can see, not just an intellectual reaction, but a really emotional reaction to a really, really good talk, and amazing images as well. To say that you didn't sort of have any, I think you undercooked yourself a little bit there. They were absolutely fabulous. So we normally you can do a virtual round of applause. There is a clap symbol, or you can just clap with your microphone off. But thank you very, very much.
Thank you all very much. It's been a lovely audience.
I do think it's so fascinating that so many of the fishermen said they couldn't swim. I know that to be factually true, but I do find it strange.
I think it's still true today.
It's still true today.
Well, it certainly came out in the oral histories we collected at Sunderland Point that many of the older generation of the fishing community at Sunderland Point, Tom Smith was a famous elder fisherman at Sunderland Point, and there's a very long recording of his that we didn't do, that was done before by, in fact, the same people behind the Northwest Sound Archive. This sort of hour-long recording with a lot of detail in it. And then right at the end, he's asked, and did you ever fall in? And he said no, and became slightly defensive and was sort of probed by it and said, well, no, I can't swim, not knowingly, was the way he reported it.
Wow.
I mean, I think Susanna knows, I may have mentioned it at one of these talks before. My grandfather was a trawlerman. And my understanding is a lot of it was superstition and actually almost connected to religious reasons, that you sort of believed that if it was your time, it was your time. And it was almost a kind of religious thing. It kind of came from a belief in God more, and that actually if you learn to swim, you are somehow messing with fate and the story that God had for you. Which is quite, it seems strange, I think, by kind of modern standards, but
I suppose it was the beginning of public baths, wasn't it, as well? Municipal baths. So it probably was only just taking off, actually.
Yeah.
But remarkable to think that there were 300 boats fishing out of Morecambe, whereas now there's maybe 2. Maybe.
Part-time as well. But yeah, I was wondering about the harbour, how much that was used, because, it had 2 sides then, didn't it? In the late 1890s. So there's the wall that's still there, and there was another one to the right as you look out. I guess that's to the east.
Are you talking about what we refer to now as the stone jetty, or was there another jetty that,
Yeah, it was out
because there was another
jetty.
one in between. Yeah.
So I guess for the steamer, any steamers would be there. So if they went off to Isle of Man or wherever. Yeah.
Certainly at when the tide is in, quite significant vessels can tie to the stone jetty today.
But I know these fishing boats also were fishing in other waters. I know Samuel Houghton, I picked him up in one of the censuses, an earlier census. He was on the Solway Bay. So they took the Lancashire nobbies up the coast, down the coast.
And what were they? What were they fishing for? Was it herring, or was it? What were they? What were they after?
I guess in the bay, lots of flatfish, I suppose.
Yeah. But I was thinking flatfish. They would have taken them from the boats, would they?
They also took shrimp from nobbies.
Yeah. Did they?
So shrimp are, I think, because I know the stories of the fishing community better in Flukeborough than I do in Morecambe, but Michelle will know the Morecambe side better. So they could trawl for shrimp from a nobby. They could take any number of the whitefish. The fishermen are incredibly flexible, and whatever was good, whatever there was plenty of, they would be catching. And if there was nothing in the sea, they'd be catching elvers in the dikes. If there was nothing there, they'd be working in Heysham Harbour or something. They were always turning their hand to the next thing. Very much more than the farming community, who would take a chance on growing something or holding stock. The fishing community was so flexible, so agile about the different product, if you like, that they took. I absolutely love the detail that you pulled out, Simon. Poor Lizzie, with some unnamed boy who was feeling presumably train sick, taking his head in and out of the window, and then sick on her only dress. I mean, that's not a great start to your holidays.
Oh, Fanny's dress. Yes,
Sorry,
I know.
Fanny,
absolutely horrible. Go to your lodging smelling of sick. It's a pretty horrible start to your holiday, isn't it? Not surprising that she remembered it 40 years later when she wrote it up.
Yeah. It answers a question actually, because I was at Jenny Brown's Point today, funnily enough, and my daughter was asking about the depth of the bay, and because I told her about tonight's talk, and she was really kind of staggered that, in such shallow water, I mean 7 to 8 feet, you'd go down and hit the bottom and potentially bounce back up again, that feels very shallow and relatively safe. But if you can't swim, you can't swim, can you? And with a bit of a breeze and then that horrible thick mud, you wouldn't have stood much of a chance, really.
I think I took 7 or 8 feet from a testimony at the time. I mean, they were close inshore at that point.
Yeah.
And the bay hadn't yet flooded properly. Yeah. So I think that's a bit of a supposition, but yeah. I mean, as you'll have seen at Jenny Brown's Point, the sands are building up pretty fast there at the moment.
Yeah.
And, Walduck's Wall is going to go back under the sand, I think.
Yeah. It's amazing how much it changes.
I just wondered if I can make it work, whether you wanted to hear a tiny clip of someone we interviewed from the fishing project, because she just remembers a little tiny fragment of a song that they used to sing about a pleasure boat.
Oh, wow.
I thought was about
Yeah.
Matchless. I don't know whether it is Matchless or is the other one, but I haven't listened to it for ages and the editing might not be brilliant, but it's only about a minute. So do you want me to play it?
Oh,
Yeah, definitely.
So it's Jackie Bailiff, whose father was a fisherman.
Tall tales. She can remember the pier burning down and the house was full of visitors.
Yes.
Yeah.
They thought that a war had started. Oh, I know what they thought. They thought the munitions factory had gone up. It wasn't. It was the pier burning down.
Oh, right.
It gets to it in a minute.
And she had tons of memories of Morecambe. She remembers there was a big drowning of trippers in a trip boat. You know, they used to take trip boats out from the jetties in summer. And latterly, I used to go on one of those as well when I was a teenager. But years before then, this would be in the 20s, probably, or 30s. It'll be documented somewhere. A whole boatload of people got drowned in a pleasure boat, in a trip boat. And Grandma said they used to sing, next time that we go fishing, we will. We'll have a steady man to steer and keep away from the West End pier. We will. Next time that we go fishing. So it had made they got drowned. It wasn't really funny.
No,
but,
got turned
but it was like a legend.
Yeah.
Jackie's interview is fascinating, actually. If you're interested in the tourism and fishing, she says a lot about that, and she had relatives who ran boarding houses and all sorts of things, and she's a really good talker, so you could just listen to her interview, to be honest, and listen to her for an hour.
Good. Well, shall we wrap it up then? Thanks again, Simon. Thanks for sticking around.
Pleasure, Tom.